What if the greatest military victory in galactic history began with mistakes so catastrophic that the winning side didn't even realize they'd already lost? Somewhere in the outer rings of the solar system, wreckage still glowed with the dying heat of plasma fire. 17 ships, reduced to drifting scrap and silence. And across 1,000 worlds, in 1,000 languages, the Galactic Empire was celebrating. Bells rang in the capital city of Threnvax Prime. Fireworks bloomed over the Emperor's palace. Citizens flooded the streets, chanting a name that had haunted their nightmares for exactly 6 hours. Earth. Earth is fallen. Emperor Kaler Dre stood on his balcony, arms spread wide, drinking in the adoration of 10 billion subjects. "Let it be recorded," he announced, his voice amplified across every screen in the Empire, that on this day, the last defiant world in known space knelt before the throne. Humanity's fleet has been annihilated. Their home world will be absorbed within the week. There is no one left to oppose us. The crowds roared. Champagne flowed in the officers' mess of the Dominion's wrath. The flagship that had led the assault, Admiral Corvin Thess, a broad-shouldered man with 3 centuries of conquest behind him, laughed as his junior officers toasted his name. It had been, by any measure, the easiest campaign of his career. 17 human ships had appeared at the edge of the system, unarmed, unshielded, moving at a crawl. His fleet had vaporized them in under 4 minutes. Not a single Imperial vessel had taken so much as a scorch mark. They didn't even fight back, one lieutenant said, still giddy with adrenaline. Legends said humans were supposed to be the last real threat left in the galaxy. That was it. That was it, Thess agreed, raising his glass. The great human resistance, gone in 4 minutes. But 3 decks below the celebration, in a cramped analysis chamber lit only by the blue glow of a dozen monitors, one officer wasn't celebrating at all. Her name was Vexilane, a junior intelligence analyst assigned to catalog the wreckage data streaming in from the battle. It was tedious work, the kind nobody else wanted, sorting through hull fragments, engine signatures, weapons residue. The kind of work that was supposed to confirm what everyone already believed. Instead, it was unraveling everything. Vex stared at her console, running the same scan a 3rd time because she refused to believe the first 2 results. The ship designs pulled from the wreckage carried no weapon housings, no armor plating beyond civilian-grade hull reinforcement, no shield generators rated for combat. Every one of the 17 destroyed vessels was built along the same specification, and that specification wasn't a warship. It was a diplomatic transport. Her hands hovered over the console. She pulled the transponder logs, the ones automatically broadcast by any vessel entering Imperial-controlled space, encrypted but not hidden. It took her 20 minutes to break the encoding. When the translation resolved on her screen, she read it 4 times before she let herself believe it. UES Concord, UES Harmony, UES Second Chance. Ship after ship, each one broadcasting the same identification code, the same registered purpose, embedded in the data the Empire's own scanners had recorded and ignored in the excitement of battle. Diplomatic envoy fleet, united Earth sovereignty, purpose, peace negotiation, non-combatant, do not engage. Vex sat back in her chair, her stomach turning to ice. Somewhere above her, the Empire was still celebrating a war that had never actually started. They believed they had crushed humanity's military in a single afternoon. They hadn't fired on a fleet at all. They had murdered a peace mission. She thought about reporting it immediately. Protocol demanded she flag any critical intelligence discrepancy to her superior officer within the hour. But something made her hesitate. She pulled up the last 30 seconds of censored data before the human ships went dark, watching the readout spike in a pattern she didn't recognize. A massive, coordinated energy discharge originating from all 17 vessels simultaneously, aimed not at the Imperial fleet, but outward, away, toward open space. It wasn't a weapon. It was a transmission. And whatever those diplomats had sent, in the final second of their lives, had been powerful enough to punch through subspace interference across an entire star system. Vex didn't know what the message said. She didn't know who or what was meant to receive it. But as she stared at the swelling number in the corner of her screen, a count of everything logged as anomalous energy signature, origin unknown, destination unknown. She understood one thing with absolute clarity. The Empire hadn't ended a war today. They had started one. And somewhere out in the dark, humanity had just heard the only words it needed to hear. She had uncovered a secret that could unravel an empire, and now she had exactly 1 hour before the truth was buried forever along with her career and possibly her life. Vex Olane sat frozen at her console for a long moment, the hum of celebration still rattling faintly through the ship's bulkheads above her. She thought about who she could tell. She thought about who would listen. The answer, she already knew, was almost no one. The Empire did not reward inconvenient truths. It rewarded victories, and today's victory had already been declared, celebrated, and broadcast to 10 billion citizens. An analyst who walked into Admiral Thessa's office and announced that the fleet had massacred unarmed diplomats instead of enemy warships would not be thanked. She would be silenced, quietly, efficiently, and permanently. But Vex had spent her entire career believing in something simple, that truth mattered more than comfort. So instead of deleting the data, she did something far more dangerous. She began digging deeper. She traced the origin registry of the U.S. Concorde and its sister ships back through decades of diplomatic archives, cross-referencing every scrap of intelligence the Empire had ever gathered on the planet called Earth. What she found unsettled her more than the wreckage ever could. Humanity had never launched a single offensive campaign in over 200 years of galactic contact. Every recorded encounter showed the same pattern: contact, negotiation, retreat. Human ships that could have engaged Imperial patrols instead withdrew. Human colonies that could have resisted annexation instead evacuated quietly, leaving nothing behind but empty structures and unanswered questions. Analysts before her had chalked it up to cowardice, to weakness, to a species too fractured or too frightened to fight. Vex now suspected the opposite. She suspected humanity had spent 2 centuries doing everything in its power to avoid a war it did not want, while quietly preparing for the day one was forced upon it anyway. The energy signature from the diplomatic fleet's final moments still nagged at her. She isolated it, cleaned the data, and ran it against every known transmission protocol in the Imperial database. Nothing matched. It wasn't Imperial technology. It wasn't anything cataloged from any of the 1,000 species under the Emperor's banner. It was something new, or something very old, hidden for a very long time. She almost missed a pattern buried inside the signal's harmonic structure, a rhythmic pulse repeating exactly 9 times before cutting off. 9 pulses. Vex ran it through a linguistic decryption algorithm on a hunch, treating it not as a weapon signature, but as language. The translation that resolved on her screen made her blood run cold. Diplomacy has failed. War has been chosen. 9 words. A single sentence, broadcast in the final seconds of 17 dying ships, sent not as a distress call, but as a declaration, a final message from a people who had exhausted every peaceful option and were now, at last, releasing themselves from centuries of restraint. Vex didn't know where the signal had been sent. She didn't know what it would trigger, but she understood with absolute certainty that the celebration happening 3 decks above her was about to become the single greatest miscalculation in the history of the Empire. She should have reported it. She should have flagged it through every proper channel and let the machinery of Imperial bureaucracy grind slowly toward whatever response it might muster. Instead, she found herself doing something she never expected. She hoped humanity's mysterious message had reached wherever it was going. Because if the pattern she'd uncovered was true, if this species really had spent 200 years preparing quietly for exactly this moment, then nothing the Empire had built, no fleet, no fortress, no army, was going to be enough. 40,000 light years away, in a control room buried 3 kilometers beneath the surface of Earth, a single alert console blinked to life for the first time in over a century. A technician who had trained for this moment his entire career, never truly believing he would see it, stared at the screen in disbelief before keying the emergency channel with hands that would not stop shaking. "Confirm signal authentication," he said, voice tight. "Confirm. Confirm. Confirm." The response came back within seconds, verified, absolute, undeniable. He looked up at the room of officers who had gone utterly silent around him and spoke the words that would end 2 centuries of quiet waiting. "Command," he said. "Wake them up." For 200 years, humanity had been hiding the greatest military force the galaxy had ever seen. And now, in a single instant, every one of those secrets was about to come roaring to life. Across the Milky Way, in places no imperial star chart had ever marked, things that had waited in silence for generations began, all at once, to stir. On a moon orbiting a dead gas giant on the far edge of imperial space, a mountain split open along a seam that had been carved with patient precision decades earlier. What emerged from within wasn't rock. It was a shipyard, vast and dark, its lights flickering on one section at a time as ancient reactors spun back to life after a century of dormancy. In the asteroid belt of the system so unremarkable, it had never warranted a name on imperial maps. Hollowed-out rocks began to hum. Inside them, fleets that had never been counted in any imperial census, because they had never been seen by any imperial census, powered-up engines built from technology the Empire didn't know existed. And on 100 worlds humanity had supposedly abandoned over the decades, quiet colonies that appeared to have withered and died were, in fact, exactly the opposite. Beneath collapsed domes and empty streets, entire cities thrummed with life, populated by generations of humans who had spent their whole existence training, building, and waiting for a single message that most of them had begun to believe would never come. Diplomacy has failed. War has been chosen. It reached them all within the same hour, relayed through a network so old and so deeply buried that the Empire had cataloged its structures 100 times without ever recognizing what they were. Communication towers disguised as dead satellites, relay stations mapped as mining debris, an entire invisible nervous system spanning the galaxy, built slowly and carefully across 200 years by a civilization that had understood long before anyone else exactly what kind of galaxy it lived in. Aboard Earth's deepest command bunker, General Amara Okafor stood before a wall of screens lighting up one by one as confirmation streamed in from outposts she had spent 30 years helping to build and had never been permitted to speak of, even her own family. Her voice, when she finally gave the order, was calm, steady, almost gentle. "All units, this is Earth Central Command," she said. "The peace mission has failed. Our envoys are confirmed dead. Activate Directive Sunrise." Somewhere above the atmosphere, satellites that had spent decades disguised as harmless debris unfolded into weapons platforms capable of leveling an Imperial battle fleet in a single volley. In hangars beneath 100 worlds, ships that made the Empire's most advanced cruisers look like relics of a bygone age began rolling out toward the stars, engines glowing with a soft white light unlike anything Imperial engineering had ever produced. It wasn't chaos. That was the detail that would haunt Imperial historians for generations to come. There was no scrambling, no confusion, no desperate improvisation. Every ship, every soldier, every commander moved with the practiced calm of a plan rehearsed 10,000 times. Because it had been. Humanity hadn't spent 2 centuries hiding out of fear. It had spent 2 centuries preparing, hoping every single day that the preparation would never be needed. Now that hope was gone, and what replaced it was something far more dangerous: certainty. Back aboard the Dominion's Wrath, still glowing with the afterglow of celebration, Admiral Thess received a report that would have seemed absurd only hours earlier. Long-range sensors across 3 Imperial systems were registering unidentified power signatures. Dozens of them, then hundreds, blooming across the dark like stars igniting all at once. "Define unidentified," Thess said, setting down his glass. The sensor officer's face had gone pale. "Sir, the signatures don't match anything in our database. Power output readings are..." "Sir, they're off the scale. Whatever these are, they're not scout ships." Thess felt the first cold thread of doubt work its way through his celebration-warm confidence. "Where are they?" The officer's hands trembled slightly over the console. "Everywhere, sir. They're appearing everywhere." Far away, in her analysis chamber, Vex Solane watched her own monitors ignite with the same impossible readings, and understood, with a certainty that chilled her to bone, that the war the Empire believed it had already won had, in truth, not even begun. The Empire had 1,000 years of conquest behind it, and had never once faced an enemy that could match its power, until the moment its shipyards began falling in silence, one after another, without a single warning shot fired. The first Imperial shipyard to fall was Calethorn Station, a fortress-class construction platform that had built more warships than any single facility in Imperial history. It had stood for 3 centuries, defended by layered shields, thousands of defense turrets, and a permanent garrison fleet. It fell in under 2 minutes. Human vessels didn't announce themselves with hails or ultimatums. They arrived in absolute silence, engines running dark, and unleashed weapons the Imperial defense grid had no answer for. Precise, devastating, and almost surgical in their restraint. Shield generators failed instantly, as though the technology behind them had simply been switched off from the inside. Turret arrays went dark one by one, disabled rather than destroyed. Not a single life support system was touched. Not a single crew quarter was breached. When the smoke cleared, Calethorn Station drifted dead in space, powerless, weaponless, and entirely intact. Its 10,000 personnel alive, stunned and utterly unable to fight back. It happened again at Vesseler shipyards, and again at the Threnvax orbital defense ring, and again, across a dozen systems simultaneously, as if some vast coordinated hand had reached out and, in the span of a single afternoon, begun quietly dismantling the greatest war machine the galaxy had ever known. Aboard the Imperial capital, panic spread to the palace corridors faster than any official announcement could contain it. Emperor Draith, still basking in the glow of his premature victory speech only hours earlier, found himself staring at reports he refused to believe. "This is impossible," he said, for perhaps the 20th time, to an audience chamber full of advisors who had no better answers than he did. "We destroyed their fleet. I watched the reports myself. Humanity has no military left to speak of. It was Vexolane, summoned, against every expectation, directly into the Emperor's chamber after her data had finally, unavoidably, made its way up the chain of command, who found the courage to say what no one else in the room dared to. 'Your Majesty,' she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. 'We didn't destroy their military. We destroyed a peace delegation.' Humanity was trying to negotiate an end to hostilities that hadn't even started yet. What you're seeing now isn't retaliation from a broken fleet. It's the response of a civilization that has been quietly preparing for exactly this outcome for 200 years. The chamber fell silent. "You're telling me," the Emperor said slowly, "that we started this war." "I'm telling you," Vex replied, "that we ended their patience." Admiral Thess, present via hololink from the front lines of the collapsing defense grid, looked as though he had aged a decade in a single afternoon. "Your Majesty, I need authorization to mobilize the 3rd and 9th Fleets immediately, if we can consolidate our forces." "Belay that," Vex interrupted, drawing a sharp look from the Emperor. "Sir, with respect, every fleet we've sent to intercept so far has been disabled, not destroyed. They're not trying to kill us. They're demonstrating exactly how thoroughly they could, if they chose to. Concentrating our forces will only give them a bigger target." Thess's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had commanded fleets that annihilated planetary defenses in hours. He had never, in 3 centuries of service, faced an enemy that could dismantle his forces without firing a single lethal shot. Outside the palace windows, the sky over the Imperial capital flickered. The telltale shimmer of subspace vessels dropping out of transit in staggering numbers, arriving not to attack, but simply to be seen. A silent demonstration of force so overwhelming that no Imperial officer in the chamber needed further explanation of what it meant. Humanity wasn't coming to destroy the Empire. It was coming to end it. And for the first time in 1,000 years of unbroken conquest, Emperor Kaler Draith felt something he had never once experienced in his long and violent reign. Fear. 1,000 years of imperial conquest had come down to this single moment. A fleet powerful enough to erase a civilization, hovering silently above the capital, waiting only to see whether its enemy would choose wisdom or ruin. They called it the Long Silence, the 12 hours during which human forces surrounded the imperial capital without firing a single shot. It was, by every measure the Empire understood, an act of madness. Thousands of human vessels hung in formation above Threnvax Prime, an armada so vast it blotted out the starlight. And yet they did nothing. No bombardment, no invasion force, no demand transmitted to the panic static of Imperial communication channels. They simply waited. It was General Amara Okafor herself who finally broke the silence, her image resolving on every screen across the capital simultaneously. Palace terminals, public broadcast networks, even the personal comm device clipped to Emperor Dratha's own robes. There was no anger in her voice, no triumph, only a tired, measured calm that unsettled the Emperor far more than rage ever could have. "People of the Empire," she began. 200 years ago, humanity made a promise to itself that it would never be the first to choose violence, no matter the cost of that restraint. Today, that promise was broken, not by us, but by you. Your emperor ordered the destruction of an unarmed peace delegation. 17 ships, 312 diplomats, scientists, and translators, whose only mission was to prevent exactly the war you now find yourselves losing. Across the capital, 10 billion citizens who had celebrated a false victory only a day earlier watched in stunned silence as the truth unfolded before them. "We do not want your worlds," Okafor continued. "We do not want your resources, your labor, or your submission. We want what we always wanted, an end to needless conflict. So we offer this empire one choice, and one choice only. Surrender your military command structure. Release every enslaved and annexed world under your control. Submit your emperor to trial for the murder of our envoys. Do this, and no further harm will come to a single soul on this planet. Refuse." She paused, and for the first time, something harder entered her voice. "And we will finish what your emperor started, whether he wishes it or not." In the palace's war chamber, chaos erupted. Advisors shouted over one another, demanding retaliation, demanding surrender, demanding anything that might offer a path forward that didn't end in ruin. Admiral Thess, standing at the edge of the chamber with the weight of every failed engagement pressing down on him, said nothing at all. It was Vex who finally spoke, cutting through the noise with a directness that startled even herself. "Your Majesty, this is the only offer you will get. They've already proven they can dismantle any force we send against them without losing a single ship. This is a negotiation. It's mercy. Take it." Emperor Drath turned to her, his face a mask of wounded pride. "Mercy," he repeated bitterly. "You would have me kneel before a species we conquered in an afternoon." "You didn't conquer them," Vex said quietly. "You killed people who were trying to save you from this exact moment." The Emperor's eyes swept across the room, searching for support, for someone who might tell him what he wanted to hear. He found none. Even Thess, the most decorated admiral in Imperial history, would not meet his gaze. In the end, it was pride, not strategy, that decided the Empire's fate. "I am the Emperor of 1,000 worlds," Drath said, drawing himself up at the last of his shattered dignity. "I will not surrender to a species that hid in the shadows for 2 centuries, ready the planetary defense grid. If they want this capital, they will pay for every meter of it." Vex closed her eyes briefly, the weight of what was coming settling over her like a shroud. Somewhere above the capital, General Okafor received the Emperor's answer relayed through Imperial diplomatic channels, and allowed herself one long, quiet breath before turning to her fleet commanders. "They've made their choice," she said. "Begin the operation. Minimal casualties. Target infrastructure, not lives. Let's finish this the way we always intended to, with restraint, not revenge." Above Threnvax Prime, 10,000 human vessels began to move. The greatest empire the galaxy had ever known was about to fall, not to fire and fury, but to single devastating truth, that the species it had underestimated had never once wanted this war, and had won it anyway. The battle for Threnvax Prime lasted 11 minutes. It would be remembered, studied, and taught in military academies across 1,000 worlds for centuries afterward, not for its scale, though it was immense, but for what it revealed about the civilization that waged it. Human vessels moved through the capital's vaunted defense grid with a precision that bordered on surgical, disabling shield arrays, neutralizing weapons platforms, and grounding the Imperial home fleet without a single planetary structure suffering catastrophic damage. Casualties, when the final count were tallied, numbered in the low hundreds, a fraction of what any Imperial campaign of similar scale would have cost an enemy world. It was, by every technical definition, a total and unconditional victory. It was also, as historians would later note, the gentlest conquest in galactic history. Emperor Killer Drath was found in his own war chamber, having refused every opportunity to flee, surrounded by advisors who had long since abandoned any pretense of loyalty. When human soldiers entered to take him into custody, he offered no resistance beyond a final, bitter question directed at the young intelligence officer who had accompanied the arresting team at General Okafor's specific request. "Why?" he asked Vex, his voice hollow with the shock of absolute defeat. "You could have destroyed us, erased this empire from existence entirely. Why show restraint to an enemy who showed you none?" Vex considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because the alternative is becoming exactly what we fought against," she said. "You mistook our patience for weakness. We won't make the mistake of thinking your cruelty makes strength. There's a difference between winning a war and losing yourself in the process. We intend to keep that difference intact." The Emperor had no answer for that. 3 days later, he stood trial before a tribunal representing not just humanity, but the hundreds of worlds his empire had annexed and oppressed across 1,000 years of conquest, worlds whose testimony painted a portrait of exploitation and cruelty that made the destruction of a diplomatic convoy seem, to many, almost a footnote in a far larger catalog of crimes. He was found guilty, sentenced not to execution, which many demanded, but to a lifetime of labor alongside the very worlds he had once ruled, rebuilding the infrastructure his conquest had destroyed, a punishment humanity insisted upon precisely because it refused to answer atrocity with atrocity of its own. In the months that followed, the dissolution of the empire unfolded with the same careful precision that had characterized its defeat. Conquered worlds were granted self-governance, their resources returned, their populations freed from generations of imperial taxation and control. Former imperial military assets were dismantled or repurposed for humanitarian use. A new Galactic Council was formed, with human representatives insisting, over considerable objection from other species eager to see humanity claim the throne for itself, that no single civilization should ever again hold the kind of unchecked power the Empire once wielded. Vexilane, once a junior analyst nobody would have noticed in a crowded room, found herself standing before that new council months later, invited to speak on behalf of the very civilization she had once served in uniform. "We spent 200 years believing that patience was a virtue worth any cost," she told the assembled representatives of 100 worlds. "We were wrong about one thing. Patience has limits, and every civilization needs to know where its own boundaries lie. But we were right about something far more important, that the measure of true strength isn't how quickly a people can wage war. It's how long they're willing to preserve peace before they're finally forced to fight, and how carefully they choose to fight once that moment arrives." Far below the council chamber, on a world once called Earth and now recognized across the galaxy as something closer to a legend, the descendants of 2 centuries of quiet preparation returned, at last, to the lives they had always hoped to live, not as conquerors, not as an empire replacing an empire, simply as a people who had waited and hoped and prepared, and who had proven, when the moment finally came, that restraint and strength had never been opposites at all. They had simply been waiting for the galaxy to understand the difference,